So, by the way, how cool is today? We all get to come to church and be with one another and hear awesome music, celebrate together. Then we get to hear an incredible list of speakers inform us about an incredibly important issue in our state. Then we get to go home and finish watching the Diamondbacks and cap it all off with the Game of Thrones. It's a good day if you have HBO and Fox, but it starts here. It occurs to me that some of you might not be walking around all week gnashing your teeth over this question of character versus soul. I know most of you are. It's probably gotten you in trouble at work. But some of you, maybe one or two, are indeed not haunted by this question and don't really care too much what the implications are, and I get that. It seems rather esoteric and largely irrelevant to our day-to-day operations. And, really, I don't even know how or why the question occurred to me. There's a certain time of the month, like a couple days ago, where blurbs are due for the sermons. And so that sounded like a good question for Unitarian Universalists. But weeks later, when I sat down to write it, it's April, but I was stuck with it, and so I stuck with it. And I'll ask you to do the same. Because that initial inspiration, that whisper, which was the tripwire for it was Donna sending me an email for blurbs, but the whisper was coming from the interactions of the interconnected web of existence, saying, talk about character versus soul. I think by listening to those and wrestling with them this week, I was shown something about our tradition and about our opportunity and theology and even the composition of myself. Turns out that the question of character versus soul is in fact very relevant to our day-to-day. Perhaps even close to fundamental. It has very much to do with the history in whose building you sit. It has very much to do with the future of our tradition and perhaps how you think about your own life. First, let's establish some working definitions. I want to be especially clear about what I mean when I say soul. Or maybe, in fact, what I don't mean. I don't mean when I say soul an immortal, ghostly mirror image of our body. I do not mean a glowing orb zooming through the astral plane. The way I think, the word soul makes no claim on an eternal state of being or an afterlife. It is also agnostic, or more precisely, adaptable on the subject of the everlasting and of God. To the question of soul and that of God are two very separate questions for me. To me, the soul of a person, or even the soul of a place or a piece of music, is the essence of it that is produced by and in addition to the collective interactions of all its component parts. I'll say that again. For me, the soul of a person or the soul of a place is the essence of it that is produced by and in addition to the collective interactions of all its collective component parts. It is an emergent quality. Now, it has been my mistake for some time to use soul and character interchangeably. It is a mistake that I will happily continue to make. However, because they both orient us to the same task. Okay, they orient us to the same task, but be that as it may, they are different. And it come to full relief in contrast with one another. They work together, but come to full relief in contrast with one another. And in that full relief, they begin to reveal their use to us. So, to contrast soul and character, for me, character is something developed. Soul is something given. Character is something earned. Soul is something unearned. Soul is something felt. Character is something proven. Soul is a sum greater than its parts, something that emerges from a body or group. Character is something that is accumulative. Soul is essential, embedded and inherent to the components of a system, and also extra to that system. And systems are what reality is made of, all the way up and all the way down. Character is work. It is a narrative. Character is something you choose insofar as choice is possible. Soul is something that you perceive. So now you know where I am coming from. You might have additional characterizations of these two words. So you'll put those in conversation with what I just said. But where am I going with this? Where are these words taking us? Where is this contrast and comparison and cooperation taking us? And I almost hate to say it because I know I sound like a broken record. And I'm probably suffering from the curse of the participant observer, where I change a thing just by looking at it. But here's the thing. Ferreting out the veracity of and distinction between character and soul all comes back to salvation. That old-timey trigger word that I hope, or at least that I've been working on redefining enough for us to make use of it. Because given our history as Unitarian Universalists, given our culture, and given the power of these words, they are indeed useful. And salvation is a useful term. By the way, I define salvation as the freedom from fear. And soul and character both root in the soil of that kind of salvation. Indeed, salvation is the seedbed of our tradition. We sprang from thinking about salvation. And as you will see, this question of soul and character marks a point on a trajectory set long ago, a trajectory very much inspirational to the evolution of Unitarian Universalism. And so, considering that here you sit, it is a trajectory that includes the soul and character of your own bad self. So oddly enough, the fruit of this week's reflection springboards from last week's reflection, which wound up springboarding from the prior week's reflection, all of which was entirely unintentional. So this is seemingly bizarre, but certainly significant. There's more emergence and interconnections there, more whispers from the web. And I'll not turn away from that voice. It is the emergence of a perspective. So 3 weeks ago, we wondered about inherent dignity and what realm of being inherent dignity could be recognized in and assigned to. And more, we wondered how it is that dignity is inherent. And both of those questions persisted into last week, where we reflected on the possibility that because sin or suffering or unskillful means, depending on your theological point of view, because sin was organic to and indeed a prerequisite of self-awareness, then the struggle against it would also be inherent. And it is in that struggle, perhaps, where human dignity emerges. There may be other sources of inherent dignity, but last week we reflected on the possibility that human dignity emerges from the struggle with the personal and social cost of self-consciousness. The aim of that struggle is to live in such a way that we feel connected to, but distinct within the web of existence. And I think this is accomplished, or at least practiced, by a non-anxious presence. Perhaps that mandala that you were working with earlier. Non-anxious presence, non-reactive presence, which is to say a presence not beholden to fear. So in a word, salvation. Because this is no surprise in a way, given that our principle that includes the inherent dignity of every person is a direct descendant from our universalist heritage, and universalism is a tradition defined expressly by the way that they thought about salvation. It was a different kind of salvation. It evolved to where we are, but nonetheless, universalism sprang from concerns about salvation. And I know I've skipped a few steps, and it's possibly not clear how we started off talking about character and soul and wound up talking about salvation. Well, it may not be clear, but it is the mirror image of Unitarian Universalist history, where the question of salvation indeed led us to the category of character. So let us consult for a moment this historical mirror. In the distance, in the background, we see an ancient lifestyle bereft of hot tubs and internet and grocery stores and vaccines. We see that life was nasty, brutish, and short. And because of that, we can understand how close to the bone the yearning for salvation was. But for them, salvation was not attainable necessarily in this nasty life, but only in the hereafter. Life was so hard, it was inconceivable to think about being saved while you were still alive. Given what they were looking at, there's some sense in that. Now, just a wee bit closer, we see the theology of the Holy Roman Empire, who, noting the work that Christ did on this earth, that their Christ did on this earth, they held that salvation was procured through action. Now, that action probably began as prayer and loving your neighbors, but it somewhere along the line wound up meaning the payment of indulgences. That is, your works were translated into coin, and that coin transmigrated into the Pope's robes as you thereby booked your room in the hotel hereafter. Incidentally, if this is what you thought was going to happen when one of Tom Bunch, one of his minions, came calling last month in stewardship, I'm afraid you'll have to set up a pastoral care appointment. So looking back to the mirror, we nearer to us see Martin Luther and after him John Calvin, who reacted to the theological travesty of indulgences resulting from the Catholic doctrine of salvation by works by coming up with the Reformed doctrine of salvation by faith. And while this too likely started as a well-intended and necessary theological adjustment, it wound up leading to a doctrine of predestination, meaning that only the grace of God could save you. And since God was omniscient and knew before the starting gun who would win the race, there was nothing you could do to change your eternal destination. You worshiped and believed basically to cover your butt. And if you did worship, you might not be damned. But if you didn't worship, that was a pretty good indication of where you were headed. So that's the doctrine of salvation by faith. And looking back again in the historical mirror, a little bit more to the foreground yet, we happily and finally see American Unitarians and Universalists who said, to paraphrase, "Give me a freaking break, dude. A loving God would not create beings to see them suffer for eternity." So out with salvation by faith and works. Especially the Universalists came to the conclusion that the only God that they could believe in was one who eventually, anyway, restored all his creation to his presence. The gender is based in the times, by the way. So this was a theological claim based on the character of a loving God. The Unitarians weren't quite yet all ready to go that far. Instead, they came up with another means of salvation, salvation by character. This was a neat trick. Like salvation by works, it gave agency to the quest for salvation. How you behaved in this world mattered. What you did mattered. But character, while behaviorally exhibited, is an internal process. How you believed also mattered. It was not enough to pay to play without integrity. Nor was it simply a matter of a cliquish deity's questionable discretion. Indeed, that character is an internal matter. Because it is an internal matter, it opens the door to salvation being an internal matter, freeing us from its exclusive location in the afterlife. So returning to the mirror, we now see our own somewhat surprised and delighted faces. When we first considered the question, it seemed that the category of character was the property of the curmudgeony old atheists and humanists, while the category of soul belonged to those crackpot theists and lightheaded pagans. But lo, it's my favorite quote from the Bible. Lo. But lo, The category of character as it has evolved in the tradition in whose house you now sit, in whose house you have built, has everything to do with salvation. The category of character as it has evolved in the house wherein you now sit has everything to do with salvation. So then the question comes, in a world with hot tubs and vaccines, from what do we need to be saved? Well, if you are seriously asking that question, you might consider your pride as a place to start looking. Thank you. If you didn't find that funny, you might consider your sense of humor as a place to start looking. Or the violent systems in which we are inextricable participants. Or our own self-righteousness or self-disdain. You know, our organic sinful nature. Our own automaticity. Our reactions to our circumstances. Our reactions to the divided and opposed desires to be both a part of it all and still our distinct and identifiable self. From what do we need to be saved? Fear. And character and soul are both means to salvation. I don't know if we get there with only one. They are not synonymous, but neither are they oppositional. They are indeed cooperative. Soul points to what is inherent and emergent in us. Soul points to grace and the perception of grace, not the self-serving grace of Calvinism, but the all-encompassing grace of all the good in our lives for which we are not fundamentally responsible. Which, if you ask me, is all the good in our lives. Character, on the other hand, points to practice. On the cooperative shaking hand, other hand, points to practice. You might say, in that case, character points to choice. I do not, but you might. I say character points to practice, to the stories we tell ourselves in order to turn them into habits. Not a story about our souls being the stakes in some celestial poker match, but a story wherein every individual has inherent dignity, perhaps due to our struggle with our organic predicament. I also mean a story wherein we are all, and with everything else in existence, interconnected. Character points to the practice of that story. So soul versus character, atheist versus theist. These are disputes only for the tired, the ungenerous, the unimaginative. But for us, for the inspired, compassionate, and creative, for us, these are adventures.